Welcome everyone to today's webinar. We can see that you're coming in. If you want to, please use the chat function to let us know which country, which city or state you're joining us from. We are delighted to welcome you to our webinar today titled Know the Context, Communication Models for Interpreters. Again, hello everyone. My name is Analia. I am the manager of training and curriculum here at Cross-Cultural Communication, the leading US training agency for medical and community interpreting, and creators of Blue Horizon, our online learning platform for our self-paced and live training programs. I will be your host for today's one-hour webinar. Also with us today is my colleague, Andrew Hall, Cross-Cultural Communication Publications Manager. Andrew will manage the chat and will provide useful information throughout the webinar. Before we begin, and as we wait for everyone to come online, I would like to share a few pieces of training listed on our website for the spring of 2025. Andrew will share the link for each training session. And as I mentioned them, please remember that CC operates in Eastern Time Zone. Okay, the first training, symbols and note-taking, advanced strategies for consecutive interpreting. This workshop will be held on April 15 and 17th from 6 to 8 p.m. We will dive deep into the use of symbols for concepts and terminology found in community, medical, and legal interpreting. Register by Friday, March 21st, and save $35. Next training, translation for community interpreters. This two-day course will take place online on May 3rd and 10th. Learn about the 10 steps in the translation process and apply essential translation principles and strategies to short sample materials used in community settings. Register by Saturday, April the 5th, and save $55. Okay, we're looking after you. We're giving you savings, people. Okay, next, TCII-TOT. The TOT trains and licenses interpreters to deliver the Community Interpreter International Program. This allows you to run your own training programs with the help and support of CCC. The summer session starts on July 7th. And finally, just a heads up that a brand new program is almost here. It is the Educational Interpreter Online, a self-paced course specifically for interpreters working in a school setting. Stay tuned, as more information about that will be coming soon. Alrighty, now I will go over a few things regarding the webinar. These are important reminders, everybody, okay? The webinar presentation will last 40 to 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A time between 15 to 20 minutes. And you are welcome to ask questions to our presenter. During the webinar, please keep the Q&A feature open and use the Q&A to submit your questions to our presenter. For other comments or questions for us at Cross-Cultural Communications, please use the chat feature instead. And if you want everyone to see your comments in the chat, please make sure your chat is set to everyone. Lastly, if you want to stay on after our presenter leaves at the end of the hour to chat with Andrew and me, we will be happy to answer your questions about both cross-cultural communications and Blue Horizon. As always, we're happy to say that this webinar has been approved for CE use. Please remember that 24 hours after the webinar, attendees will be mailed a link to download the certificate of attendance. It will go to the mail you used to register for the webinar. Please, if you don't see it right away, check your spam or junk folder And remember, certificates are only available for attendees of the live session of this webinar. They must be downloaded within 3 weeks of today's session. Let me repeat that. Please download your certificates of attendance no later than 3 weeks of today's session. Don't delay. We won't be able to send your certificate after 3 weeks. Also, after you download the certificate and save it to your computer, you will want to add your name to the fillable field. You can also print it, of course, if you choose to do so. Okay, without further ado, let's begin our webinar titled, Know the Context, Communication Models for Interpreters. I have the pleasure and the honor to present today Lorena Castillo. Welcome, Lorena. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about my friend. She's also my friend. Lorena is a servant leader in the world of language services, blending her passion for communication with over 20 years of hands-on experience as a trilingual interpreter, as a trilingual medical interpreter. Fluent, let's see, she's fluent in English, Spanish, and American Sign Language, and skilled in Swahili and Italian. Lorena has dedicated her career to breaking down language barriers with empathy and transparency. I just have to tell you, Lorena, I love it. As an instructional design manager at AMN Healthcare, Lorena doesn't just create training programs. She builds inclusive, value-driven learning experiences. She leads a talented team in designing custom curricula for remote interpreters, focusing on ethical standards, cultural competence, and learner empowerment. Lorena's certifications include CMI Spanish, CHI Spanish, and ATD Master Instructional Designer. Lorena, what a pleasure and honor to have you with us today. The floor is yours. Thank you, Lorena.
Thank you so much, Analia. I am so excited to be here with you all today. Thank you for taking the time. I know it's a busy day, so thank you so much for being here. Today, we're going to talk about communication models, and we're going to focus on context, which, in my opinion, as an interpreter, it's probably one of the components in the communication event that can be sometimes a little challenging to navigate. So let's get started. Let me just go ahead and share my screen. Okay. There we go. Okay, so know the context. Before we get started, let's talk about communication models. What are they? So communication models are like visual representations. They conceptualize different aspects of communication. They help us simplify the process. And this is really helpful to us as interpreters because there's been other professionals in the field of linguistics, communication, psychology, sociology that have taken the time years ago and even up until now to conceptualize what happens when people communicate. They can help us to think about the process of communication more deliberately, because we can actually pinpoint various processes within the communication event. And as an interpreters, that can help us to better prepare for the sessions that we interpret. When we talk about communication models, we can categorize them into 3: linear, interactive, and transactional. Because time, we only have about 40 minutes, we're not going to go into all of them. We're going to take a deep dive into an interactive model and also touch on a transactional model. However, I wanted to share the 3 categories in case you are you like deep dives. Feel free. I think the linear models do a great job at identifying the various aspects of communication. However, the interactive and transactional models evolved and captured nuance, such as context and other elements. So let's get started with the interactive model. There are two types of interactive communication models that we can identify that are known. It's the Osgood-Schramm model and the Wesley and McLean. Because of time, we're not going to have time to dive into the Wesley and McLean, but this is also a great one that you can look up. Osgood and Schramm model is a great model for us because it highlights, away from the linear models, it highlights that when people communicate, it's not just a one-way communication. It's not the sender creates a message and then it's sent almost like a computer. They identify communication as a circle, meaning both the person that's sending messages, receiving messages are both important to that event, and they both contribute to the outcome of the communication event. So that's actually really important for us as well. They also include the very reason we're here today, context. They also talk about context. So that's another reason why I chose to take a deep dive on the Osgood and Schramm model. Let's take a look at the components within this model. And I want to warn you, the next slide is a little bit heavy on the eyes, and I do apologize in advance. But I wanted to ensure that you could see the whole process, and then we can talk about it. So this is the Osgood-Schramm model, and it starts with encoding. Interestingly, for this model, it's the first time, well, it's one of the models that identified, instead of the people sending and receiving as senders and receivers, they're more identified as communicators, because they wanted to put them on an equal playing field, I guess, just to make sure that when people communicate, this concept shows that they don't just wait in line to receive information. A person initiates a message or encodes it, and they have to choose how to deliver that message. They can use symbols, they can use words, they can use gestures, sign language, they can convey their thoughts in a number of ways. But those are the responsibilities of the person or the communicator that encodes and sends that message. The other person or the other participant in that communication event's responsibility is to receive that information, to decode that message, is the way that this model called it. The responsibility of the receiver was to receive the message through sensory input and extract meaning. And it's interesting that during the process of decoding, the person that is extracting that meaning, they're using a number of things, not just words. They're using their own context, their own knowledge, but they're also picking up on various aspects of the communication event. So this is where, words aren't just the only way that we communicate. We're actually communicating in various ways. Even now, sorry, I'm using my hands a lot. I use my hands a lot often because of sign language and because that's just the way I communicate. So that's a perfect example. If you are watching me, you're probably a little distracted by my hands, and I do apologize. The next one is shared field of experience. So as people or communicators go back and forth, they encode and decode back and forth, back and forth. The thing that either works for them or affects the effectiveness of those messages back and forth is what Osgood and Schramm identified as the shared field of experience. And shared field of experience is interesting because their perspective is the more these two communicators have experiences, knowledge, context in common, the clearer those messages will be decoded, the clearer the meaning will be extracted, especially when you're accounting for contexts like cultural, social, emotional factors. All of these areas or contexts shape how the message is received. So shared field of experience is of special importance to us as interpreters, because this is where Oswald-Schramm model attempted to conceptualize the dynamic nature of communication. This is where context kicks in my opinion. The next thing that this model identified that was unique away from the linear models was also feedback and noise. Feedback is not one way when people communicate. And when we talk about feedback, we're talking about as the message, as the initial communicator is delivering that message, whether it is through words, hands, gestures, the person decoding it is decoding it real life, taking into account their context and so on. As they are decoding, they are sending, the body automatically sends feedback to the other person. So those are the nonverbal, we talk about the nonverbal communication. That's where a feedback loop starts. Why do we say loop? Because feedback is a continuous process where the initial communicator talks about the message, right? They start delivering it. The person decoding it starts sending feedbacks. And the fact that they send that feedback in a number of ways, the initial process of the message gets altered for the better. Why? Because the person communicating is going, oh, you're understanding. Okay, I can continue. Oh no, you're not understanding. I got to go back. I got to simplify the process. And so that's the process of encoding is affected by the feedback loop. So we've learned a couple of technical words here. We've talked about encoding, decoding, shared field of experience. So the more two people can share context, knowledge, the more they'll understand each other. We've talked about the feedback loop, how it's a continuous process that affects communication. Interestingly about the feedback loop is that both communicators participate in feedback and both contribute to the outcome of that communication event. So this is a special importance for us. If you are a healthcare interpreter, I'm a healthcare interpreter. Most of my experience is in healthcare. Is a special importance because that's a value that in medicine is shared, right? The outcome of the session has a lot to do with health outcomes, and positive health outcomes can only happen if the communication is successful. So we've talked about the four. Now let's address the last one, which is noise. And I realize this word sometimes can be perceived as noise, just something that affects our hearing. And it does include that. However, Oswald and Schramm wanted to introduce the concept of anything that disrupts the communication process, anything. So it could be noise, but it could also be language barriers, as we know. It could be misunderstandings. It could be psychological processes, like maybe if you have a bias or if the other person has a bias, that's noise because it's going to affect the way the message is received. It's almost like an interference. And we often in our work talk about the importance of mitigating and minimizing bias. And this is why, because with this concept, it really identified those biases or that noise as a component that affects the feedback loop. All right. Now that we saw this and we took a tour through all of that, let's take a look at the same thing, but how we usually see it in some of the communication courses, or how some of the linguists sometimes depict this model. This may look a little more familiar to you. So I wanted to share it just in case to just kind of make that connection. So here we have the first communicator, or how other models call sender. They encode the message, and then the receiver will decode the message. Both of them will have the shared field of experience, and then the feedback loop will start, and it will be a process that continues to evolve, that can only evolve if the noise is mitigated. I wanted to mention something about this model that I think as interpreters is really helpful. And that is that in a communication event, feedback and noise and shared field of experience or lack thereof is expected. It's part of the process. So as interpreters, when we facilitate communication, when we interpret from one language into another, these are things that if we learn to predict in certain situations can actually decrease our stress levels. So it's interesting how that works. Now, let me ask you, if you are a working interpreter, or maybe you're in the field of interpreting, which part of this process do you think interpreters participate in? I'm just going to take a couple seconds. So which part of this process is an interpreter part of? Interestingly, let me take a quick look at the chat to see if I see any. Interesting, all of it. Some are saying decode, some are saying all of them, some are saying receiver. Thank you so much for the feedback. I appreciate it. I'm a really visual person, so I was saying that the fact that I can't see you is a little bit difficult, but I love the chat. So thank you for the input. Interestingly, even though the message itself is not initiated by the interpreter does start by decoding, although sometimes, in some cases, they start by sharing some brief things like, hey, I'm the interpreter. But if we're talking about the communication event itself, they start at that receiving process, but then eventually participate in all of them. Why? Because they decode the message, just like any other communicator. They have to extract the meaning. They have to also go into their previous knowledge. They have to tap into that prefrontal cortex that arranges how they're going to say it, what they know, but also have to go through that amygdala, that back part of the brain. And we'll talk a little bit more about that process in just a second. But they decode that message. And then when they deliver that message, that's an additional component that we do not have time to go into, that they take the message and then translate it into the target language and then start with the feedback loop. This is the first call out that I'd like to make in regards to feedback and noise for interpreters, where we do have to develop a certain level of flexibility. And I know that word sometimes can be perceived as, no, interpreters cannot go outside of what they hear. That is not what I'm trying to say. I'm not trying to say that interpreters can add or subtract or omit from the message. What I am saying or arguing is that if in a regular communication event, feedback and noise, which is where context happens, are so flexible, right? Because both the communicators are receiving it and sending it, and they're both participating in this feedback loop. As an interpreter, it is only natural that we're also going to have to develop the same skills, because now we are contributing to a triadic encounter. And perhaps you've heard that word before, triadic communication. This is what we mean by that. Triadic communication is that communication that is affected when a third person comes in. This same diagram could look really complicated. We could probably make a 3D one. Why? Because the third person, as an interpreter, is receiving that initial message. But has it happened to you in a session that the patient, who may have some limited English skills, but even if they don't, they're still receiving the message in a secondary way and can still participate in the feedback process, in the feedback loop? So now the feedback loop is maybe the provider or the person who initiated the message. The interpreter is providing feedback, like I just did. If they're listening to the message, they're kind of going, yes, I got that. And the patient may also be nodding as well. Why are they nodding? That's part of context. They may be nodding because they're thankful to be there and they're like, yes, this conversation's happening and I'm about to understand. Or they could be nodding because they do have some limited English skills. They've had that appointment before and they understand some of the words that are happening. And sometimes they nod because they understand the gist of it. In some cases, And I know as an interpreter, this can be a challenging situation. In some cases, through that feedback loop, that third person will jump in and may actually say yes or no or answer the question before we can even interpret. Because communication has this feedback loop, as interpreters, immediately in the back of our brain, what are we thinking about? We're like, oh, did they understand everything? What was the meaning? Did they catch everything? And that's when in the prefrontal cortex, you start planning, like, okay, what's the next step? Do I check in? Do I say the full statement? In some cases, if the situation is an emergency, the interpreter may not have time. In other cases, when the situation allows, the interpreter will ask permission and say, I realize you answered, and they may continue interpreting. So that's where the flexibility is at, that the interpreter is the one that ensures that that feedback loop continues and that the information is not understood, because it is not the responsibility of the interpreter to understand for the patient, but it is our responsibility to ensure that we take that message and that we deliver it with as much context and as much shared field of experience. I think one of the unique things about interpreting is that in regular communication, both communicators have to attempt to detect what their shared field of experience is, and they do that naturally. But with an interpreter present, it's actually better, in my opinion, especially when it's a specific environment like healthcare, because we already know many components of that situation. And so we can actually detect where the shared field of experience is lacking, the areas that they may not be working towards a conversation. And we can decide if relevant, if it's the goals of the conversation, if we need to, what the NCIHC calls share relevant context. So when we're talking about sharing relevant context, we're actually talking about making this circle bigger so that the message can actually be successful. So I'm just going to pause just a second because I do see some comments. Oh, okay. All right. So now that we talked about this frame, let's take a closer look at the encode. At the decode. Why am I doing this? Most of the time as interpreters, we're decoding. We're also encoding at times, but none of the information or message that we encode is messages. I shouldn't say none. Most of the time in the session, when we're encoding messages, is because we've received it from somebody else. Sometimes we do encode some things that come from us, but most of the time is the message that we receive. So let's take a quick deep dive. All right. Interpret or decoding communication. When I use the word interpret, this is a word that's used in linguistics for interpreting in the brain, like how you extract meaning. So it's not language interpreting. I just wanted to clarify that just in case so it doesn't confuse you. Let me just make sure my notes are here. Okay. So let's break down what happens in the brain when we interpret communication. It's very similar to the conversation we just had, but we're going to break it down. So hang tight. The first thing we're going to do is, as the message is being delivered, we receive the message or decode the message through sensory input. The first step is always either hearing, seeing. For example, when someone speaks to us, if it's a hearing person, the sound waves travel into our ears. If it's a visual message, our eyes receive the visual cues that starts the process. If you're deaf and blind, it's tactile. That's the first thing, through touch. So the first thing that happens is that sensory reception or sensory input. The brain uses that to start processing it. What is being said? What is the part of the auditory cortex, if it's audio, visual cortex? All of these signals are being sent to areas in our brain for further analysis. Then we're comprehending the message, which is really the decoding process. This is a really complex cognitive process. The brain begins in the Wernicke's area, in the left temporal lobe, that is critical for understanding. That's when it starts taking into account contextual information. How do we know that? Well, because the brain in the frontal cortex, prefrontal cortex, but also in the back of the brain is trying to gauge, how is this message being delivered? It's not just paying attention to the words, it's also saying, what is the body language like, facial expressions? And this is happening automatically. That's when we know when somebody says, hey, how are you? Versus, hey, how are you? There's a difference, right? And the brain is able to, in a deep analysis, deduce that, oh, they're not really asking how I'm doing for real. So the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala in the back of the brain play some key roles in the brain to help us process higher level contextual information. And all this is happening without us even having to be aware of this process. We're just taking a deep dive because we're interpreters. Now, the third thing that happens is recognizing and interpreting intent. This is when evaluation starts. The brain starts to interpret the underlying intent behind the message. It really helps when the person decoding understands the intent, but they're also taking in consideration the place that is being said. Like, I'll give you an example. If at home somebody says, hey, how are you doing? Or, hey, how are you doing? Regardless of the tone, it's a very different expectation than if somebody says that at the park or at the hospital. So the brain starts to interpret underlying intent. It uses information about what they see, the context, like angry, happy, sarcastic. And then the amygdala, which is where our emotional processing, and the insula as well, starts helping us detect those signals. The brain interprets the message's meaning. It starts giving us, using all the context and giving us signals, but it also uses our own personal experiences and cultural understanding throughout this process. That's when, if you're familiar with Daniel Goleman and his work, he calls it amygdala hijacking, because that's when the brain sometimes jumps if it detects some contextual factors that lets you know, hey, you're either not safe, or hey, this person's angry. It's constantly assessing whether the message is positive, negative, neutral, or if it requires further clarification. The next thing that happens is forming understanding or making sense out of that message. And this is why we call it, Daniel Goleman calls it amygdala hijacking, because when we respond to those emotional signals, we haven't yet gone through the prefrontal cortex. So there may be some contextual factors that we are not taking into account. In the fourth step, forming understanding, that's when the brain accesses long-term memory to connect the new message with prior knowledge and past experiences. Specifically, the hippocampus, it helps us retrieve any relevant past experiences to compare to the current message. And this happens automatically. And so this process of creating that past experience connection is what enables the brain to make sense of the message and interpret the message based on past learning. How does knowing this help us? Well, the more we develop our knowledge, the more we become really familiar with the components in communication, or at least the attempts to conceptualize what happens in communication, the more that we can create more of those memories and knowledge that we can tap into automatically. Sometimes when I talk about this, some of my colleagues are like, seriously, Lorena, this is too complicated. I just get in there, interpret, and get out. True. However, these brain processes are happening in our brain, whether we are aware of them or not. So if we're aware, then we can actually use them to develop different strategies. All right, let's continue on number 4. So we talked about forming understanding or making sense out of the message, creating meaning. So again, the brain doesn't just passively absorb information arbitrarily, it's constantly creating meaning. Again, if we look at communication in general, people like to add percentages. I'm not an expert in that field, so I cannot add a percentage, but I do notice that many times we extract meaning not just from the words. but from the entire interaction. All right, so now the fifth part of decoding is responding to the message in engaging in the feedback loop. So after interpreting the message in the brain, after going through that amygdala, prefrontal cortex, extracting, tapping into the previous experiences, the response can either be verbal, nonverbal. The prefrontal cortex engages in that planning and decision making. For us as interpreters, that planning and decision making involves the language conversion, involves taking into account other contextual factors that can help us to decide if we need further clarification. If we don't know a word, if you've been there where you hear the message and you start decoding it and you're like, yep, I'm planning this. And then a word comes up, either an acronym or a word that it's untranslatable, or maybe that you haven't had the opportunity to learn. What happens? That feedback loop is interrupted by noise, because all of a sudden your brain goes, whoop, I don't know that word. This is where we can develop a flexible strategy when we are responding or giving feedback, because it's expected. It's going to happen through that feedback loop, that some type of noise is going to affect the loop. And so sometimes it's internal, me not knowing a word, and sometimes is the other participants, their emotional state or their literacy in healthcare, if it's in the healthcare field. So when responding to the message, knowing what to expect from that shared field of experience, feedback loop, and noise can help us to either engage in the feedback loop then, or plan through the prefrontal cortex to do it after we've interpreted the message. In either case, we are providing feedback either way, because we're either going like this, or we're going like that, or if you're a remote interpreter, that's when you continue listening and you start planning other things so that the conversation and interpretation can be successful. So based on that feedback, it's the sixth step, we adjust based on what we hear and what is happening. This that I just described is what we mean when we say communication is dynamic, is a back and forth process, and it's really the brain constantly monitoring that feedback loop, their facial expressions, gestures, verbal cues, to gauge whether the message was understood, if it needs to be adjusted, or if we're good and can move on to the next sentence or the next concept. It's interesting to observe the neural adaptation that happens based on feedback, because if you think about it, if a communicator starts with a message, by the time that communication happens, both people through neural adaptation and mirror neurons are contributing to the success and perhaps even evolution of that same message. So it's kind of interesting how that works. I am seeing some raised hands in Zoom, and I am so sorry that I just want to let you know I see you, but because of time, we'll wait until the Q&A to review some of those questions that you may have or comments that you may have. All right, so we talked about interpret or decoding communication. We took a deep dive, so if your brain hurts a little bit, take a deep breath. Next, we're actually going to look at the same thing, but we're going to look at it from the perspective of interpretation. So what happens in the brain? So through that sensory input, we are seeing if it's verbal or nonverbal. If the provider says, for example, a healthcare provider says, you need to avoid sugary foods and eat 3 healthy meals a day to control your blood sugar. What is happening in our brain when we develop some of these flexible strategies is we comprehend the message after receiving it. So if we extract meaning from that, we're extracting perhaps avoid sugary foods, eat 3 healthy meals. This is not the only way to extract that, by the way. This is just an example. The next thing that happened is recognizing and interpreting intent. What is the intent of this provider when they say that? Well, maybe they want to offer specific guidance to the patient on managing their blood sugar. Maybe they want to ensure that they understand the advice. the goal or the intent will really depend on, you guessed it, context. This same utterance in different offices could have a different goal. The next one is forming understanding. This, when we're forming understanding, is when we're tapping into previous terminology, when we're remembering past experiences. If you're seasoned, if you're a seasoned interpreter and you're in that context, your stress levels may be lower because you know what to predict, you know what to expect. So you're very familiar with predicting what happens next. And so that process is really integrated into your process of interpretation. The next one is responding to the message. The brain takes into account context and plans. For example, these are some of the things that I noticed, just my experience, and I'd love to hear your experience on that. What would be some of the context that could affect, or noise that could affect this process? Well, the patient may not eat 3 meals a day. That may not be part of their cultural context. Healthy might not be healthy for that person. I'll give you an example. Some of my family members, when you say eat healthy, only associated to sugar, but not necessarily carbohydrates, because some carbohydrates in my culture are considered healthy because you cook at home. So this provider is saying avoid sugary foods, great, eat 3 healthy meals. Well, what does healthy look like? And is that something that the brain needs to prepare for or share relevant context? No, the interpreter has to decide. What exactly is considered sugary for the person's context versus what the provider means? These are all things that the brain can take into account when responding to that message, or when providing feedback, or what we've called recently sharing the relevant context. The last thing is adjusting based on feedback. So in the best case, this sentence is super simple and the interpreter's going, and they turn around, go through the rest of the process and interpret. In other cases, if the interpreter decides that it's important to do for the message to be successful, they might choose to talk to the provider and say, hey, sometimes this is perceived like this, or check in with the person to go, okay, you got the information. Yes, it depends. Sometimes the interpreter will ask permission to do so really openly. Sometimes the interpreter will do it briefly because of the goals of the session. It really depends on the context. So I want to do a quick check-in on the chat just in case. Okay, it looks like we were just having some audio visual. Do you have any glossary to go with some of these terms? I don't have a glossary with me, but if you are interested in looking up into communication models, there are several articles online that are scholarly that talk about the process of communication, and they define all of the terms a little bit more. Okay, so now let's look at the interpreter's process when interpreting. So we've talked about that initial process of taking the information in, and now we're gonna encode it into the message. I will recognize that this is a simplified version. If you would like a more detailed version and more official, I know in my field, Betty Colonimus is one that is known for her interpreting process. And she's written about it. She's really famous. So it's known in the ASL community. But if you're a spoken language interpreter, I found that Betty Colonimus does a great job at breaking it down for you. And it's very similar to this, but she focuses on that part of language conversion and that process that happens after you've decoded the message. Okay, so now we're interpreting. The interpreter says, in the target language, you need to avoid sugary foods and eat 3 healthy meals a day to control your blood sugar. What we've done throughout that process is we've listened, we've analyzed the context, like we just recently talked about. We encoded into the target language. This is the part that I'm suggesting you look up, the Betty Colonimus framework. We adjust as a result of the context. So that's when we decide a different strategy, or we interpret because we feel like that was enough for communication to be successful. We check for clarity and fidelity. This is the part that really pulls us back. Like, we may have some additional thoughts about the contextual factors that we're seeing, but it may not be relevant to the communication goals. And that's when the interpreter has to decide to either stay conservative or do an open intervention, like, this is the interpreter speaking, blah, blah, blah. So we check for clarity, check for fidelity, and then we continue the feedback loop that is adjusted based on feedback. All right. So all of those things that we just talked about, we talked about practicing flexible communication techniques. We talked about, number one, sharing field of experience. The strategy that we can develop from that is sharing relevant contextual information. That is an open way to be able to help those communicators to share field of experience. Number two, we talked about the feedback loop. So some flexible strategies that we can develop, which we're all really familiar with, but I hope they give you or inspire you or empower you to continue to polish them, which is the ability to clarify, identify implicit and explicit meaning, and adjust. When that feedback loop happens, it's something that is expected in communication. So if you do have to clarify a term, if you do need a moment to look up a term, it's not the end of the world. It's part of communication. And I wanted to stress that just because sometimes I think we put a lot of stress on ourselves, and this is part of the communication event. So take your time to, look up the term, or let the communicators know in the session when you do need that time. Engage in the feedback loop if necessary. Notice when the feedback loop is one that the patient is also engaged in really openly, which most of the times they are. If they do jump in and you feel that fear of, oh goodness, I have a message that I'm holding on to, don't want to lose it, and they're continuing on to the next one, just know that this is expected, because this is the nuance of triadic communication. And when we expect those things, then perhaps we can develop some other strategies, like, let me interpret it anyway, let me ask for a moment. Some interpreters may actually choose to perhaps set the rules of engagement then. Like, they may be like, oh, I noticed that you're understanding, because maybe that's the first time they realize, oh, they speak more English. Would you like me to continue interpreting? Do you want to use? And so that's when they can negotiate those communication strategies in a way that works for the participants. Because in the end, that's all that matters, that they're able to communicate. Number three is noise. Identify and mitigate noise. And again, noise is to be expected. It's about 12-ish here in Eastern time. Noise could be you're hungry, it's time for lunch. Noise could be you're tired. This was a deep dive that you were not expecting, and your brain is going like that. That's noise. So how do we mitigate noise, whether internal, what Robin Dean in her framework demand control schema calls intrapersonal demands? How do we mitigate those and recognize those in a way that honors our being, but at the same time recognizes the importance of not being biased in a communication event that doesn't start with us? So those are the three flexible communication techniques that I wanted to share with you today. I do know Analia wanted to ensure we left the 15 minutes for questions. So I'm going to go ahead and skip through the transactional Barloon's model, but it was basically the same thing as the transactional. The dance helical model strategies are very similar to the other, but this model is really interesting, that this model emphasizing feedback is what changes communication. That feedback loop we talked about, how it changes the outcome. So they focus more on that feedback loop. So if you're interested, you can look up the dance helical model. These are some of the strategies that I was able to extract: the clarification requests, confirming understanding, like we talked about, redirecting and reframing when you sense a misunderstanding, and adjusting speed and clarity. All righty, so that is the end of my presentation. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Analia. It was such a pleasure to talk to you today. I really enjoyed some of the comments. I know this was a quick time and I try to pack as much information for you. I hope this is inspirational. So thank you, Analia, for the invitation. I'm super excited to have shared this information with you all today.
Oh my gosh, I have learned so much, Lorena. And let me tell you, I've been with Lorena for 2 years and I never stopped learning from her. Before I mention the questions, these are some of like the chat comments.
Okay.
Awesome, fantastic. About your presentation, they say awesome, fantastic, great info, love it, incredible, excellent info. You're amazing. You're a great presenter. Oh my gosh, Lorena, I could just go on and on and on. Was amazing. Wow. Okay, let's get to the questions. Everybody's really thanking you for joining us today. Okay, we do have a few. One of the questions, this was at the very beginning, Lorena, it was about 11:47. And the question was, how does this work in telephonic interpreting? I'm not really sure what they meant, but maybe if you go back to your slides in your brain.
Sure, it's the same process. I just think the context is different. Because what happens in the brain when we are communicating, that message is being delivered through the telephonic means, but what happens in the brain is the same. Of course, the way you take context into consideration is going to be reduced because you cannot see their emotions. You cannot see some of the things they're doing in the room. So I think it's important to recognize that audio is going to be one of the ways that you take into account context, which might mean that feedback loop, when created by the interpreter, needs to have different strategies, such as, I'm sorry, can you get closer to the phone? These are some of the strategies we're familiar with, but I think if we understand proactively that we're engaged in that feedback loop and our ability to take in context is lessened, then we can develop more strategies to help us reduce that stress.
Lorena, I want to chime in what you just said, because I never heard of feedback loop, and the way that you presented it was so impactful to me, because you were talking about the feedback loop is that point of clarification, right? Getting more information. And I thought about just communication between one another. You know, we don't need an interpreter, and we're still in that feedback loop in which we have questions for the person that just said something. We don't really know, or are unclear what they meant. And I love that you said with the feedback loop, and as interpreters, that we shouldn't feel bad about the fact that we need clarification, that we need repetition. Because now that I'm thinking more about it, Lorena, we do that in regular day-to-day communication. Anyway, oh my gosh, I just love it. You gave me like this light bulb went off. It's like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, exactly. And I think my colleagues, ASL interpreters, when they work with the CDI, they engage in that feedback loop because they have the secondary interpreter. So they ensure that the person continues to receive that loop, that they're looped into the feedback that is being received, and also collect that feedback as it's happening. So I think as spoken language interpreters, sometimes it can be hard to make room for that because we feel with any context that we have to interpret right away. And sometimes we have to be perceived as like complete and almost like robots. And we're communicators, just like the participants in the communication event, and clarification sometimes needs to happen, and that's normal.
And Lorena, you said CDI. Would you explain to our audience? Not everybody is familiar with CDI.
Sorry.
We're all learning today, people. I love it. Please go ahead.
So certified deaf interpreters. So in ASL interpreters, we have hearing interpreters that interpret, but then we also have language specialists who are certified deaf interpreters. And in a session, the two will work together to ensure that feedback loop, to ensure that context is taken into account, and to also ensure that the patient, in this case, someone who is deaf, or hard of hearing has an additional support to make that communication event happen successfully, and that they're honored in their process of communication in a way that works. So if you didn't know, it's actually super great. I know we do it at our company all the time. CDIs are amazing at supporting the communication goals of patients. We don't have this in spoken language, obviously, because of the nature of it, but I think we can learn a lot from it.
Oh, absolutely. Okay, thank you. I just wanted to say that. Okay, I'll go to the next question. It says, this is an outstanding slide presentation for visuals such as myself. Would you, Ms. Castillo, okay, is there any book recommendations to deepen knowledge presented? So do you have any books that you recommend?
Well, there's many in linguistics on communication, and you can choose. You can look online. There's various aspects. I would say if there's one book that I can leave you with is Demand Control Schema by Dr. Robin Dean. She does a great job at this same communication model. We talked about shared field of experience. We talked about feedback, and I forgot the other one already. Because it's not in front of me, but we talked about all those contextual factors. She actually adapted a framework to help interpreters verbalize context, which is the hardest thing. So my recommendation in general would be definitely get familiar with communication models, but that will only take you so far. I think if you want to go deep, you probably want to start with Demand Control Schema by Dr. Robin Dean.
That's a great recommendation right there. Let's see. Okay, somebody says, is it considered noise when the participant has difficulty expressing their ideas and constantly modifies the segment?
Yeah, that's noise. Dr. Dean calls that, I want to say that's paralinguistic. Some of my ASL colleagues might correct me, but I would say that's because it's around how they're talking. So that's a paralinguistic demand. And I use the word demand because that's the way she uses it, but just know that's like a contextual factor. The way they speak is going to affect what you hear, and your brain is having to calibrate, like, okay, what extract meaning from that. And so in that case, the feedback loop will start because you might want to go back and go, I can't hear you. I couldn't understand. Would you mind repeating? And you shouldn't feel bad about that because it's a natural communication event. So yes. That's a great one.
Oh, wow. Okay, let's see what else we have over here. Okay, so let's go over here for the other question. So what would you do if you encounter a word or a vocabulary you don't know by using this communication process?
Well, you have a number of strategies if you don't know. I can share some strategies that I know my colleagues use, that I know I use. In some cases, if it's a remote interpreter, I've seen this happen live and I've done it myself, where as they're saying it, as I'm still decoding the message, I'm looking it up. And I will admit to that because I understand that in some situations, it's really hard because I take into account the context to openly say, wait a second, I need to look up a word. I think the important thing is to prioritize the accuracy of the interpretation. So if you can ask for a second because you are unable to do that, maybe you're on site and you do need to look something up, then I would say I just need 1 second. So you could use strategies that are hidden, like in remote interpreting, or you can use some of the open strategies if you're on site.
Okay, we have 2 more questions that I definitely want to get to it, so we'll go to the next one.
Okay.
When a patient speaks English a little bit and believes that they are good to understand correctly English and communicate, may just start ignoring the interpreter and start talking in English. I feel usually when it is going to happen. So any insights on that, Lorena, that you have? It was kind of like a comment and a little bit of a question.
Yeah, I think we have to recognize that those are challenging. But I think we also, especially in healthcare, that's where my experience comes from. The underlying or the higher values there is that they're using language to establish rapport. They may also have regular appointments. It might be their first time. Regardless of that, I think prioritizing the communicator's responsibilities in the feedback loop is important. I think clarifying to ensure that that communication is happening and that our responsibility is clear to us. For example, asking for a few seconds to check in with the patient to say,
Yes.
would you like me to continue interpreting? I noticed that you jumped in. I sense that you already speak some English, and working with both participants to kind of understand how they want you to work best. I think separating the feelings of, oh goodness, this is so frustrating, because I've been there where you're like,
Mm-hmm.
I just want to be able to interpret so you get all the information. I think being able to
Right.
support their goals and understand that they're trying to engage in a feedback loop because they understand
Mm-hmm.
that they're the main ones in the communication event is something we should respect and try to support as much as possible. I've met interpreters who say, you know what, I'm going to repeat that because I feel like there may be contextual factors that lead to a misunderstanding.
Mm-hmm.
That's another strategy. The point of the strategies is that they're flexible because they all have the same goal.
I love it. Okay, Lorena, before I ask you one more question, I do want to let our audience know, first of all, thank you for joining us today. We look always forward to having you join us at the webinar. We appreciate that you are taking time off your busy schedule to join us, to participate. I know you're excited to learn. And we just want you to know that the webinar is formally over. So if you need to dismiss yourself, you can do that. You will receive in 24 hours a link that will allow you to download your certificate of attendance. I want to remind everybody, this is so important. Please download it right away. Just make it a habit because it will not be available after 3 weeks from today. And so please do that. Also, there's going to be a survey. We do want to improve our webinars, make it better in every way. Please take a moment to answer that survey. It will benefit you and us as we're trying to continue to improve the profession and help us to grow in our development of our skills and our knowledge, etc. Okay, so I wanted to say that, so you can definitely go if you need to go, and thank you for being here. I'm going to ask Lorena only one more question. She needs to go back to work. Believe it or not, she works. And so for AMN, and they were so gracious to let her join us today, but they will want to say, yes, so thank you, AMN.
They're so supportive. They actually joined the webinar, so I'm just so thankful for them for letting me go. But yeah, I'm pretty sure in a hot second I need to go.
Yes. Okay, so final question. It says, well, it's kind of a long one, okay? It is crucial for an interpreter to maintain focus, process all information accurately, and effectively retain and interpret everything, especially during high-pressure sessions. In a consecutive interpreting model, how long should an interpreter interpret continuously before taking a break? And what is the recommended rest period before starting another session?
Oh, wow. I don't know that I have the that is a great question. I'm right there with you. I don't have an answer for that, to be honest. I think that there's research going on consecutive interpreting. I know there's some research out there already. In sign language, we see a lot more research about remote interpreting and things like that. So I can leave you with that. Maybe look up some of that research about that. We can recognize that the cognitive processes that happen in interpretation are really complex. So I think each person needs to work through that and decide, if their intrapersonal demands are allowing them, or if they've been met, so that they can continue to develop the strategy. How long should they engage in consecutive interpretation? I think I'm gonna leave that question for the experts.
That is a great question. And I love, Lorena, here's one more thing. It's like, okay, so when I ask for clarification is the feedback loop. And when there is that noise, also we're thinking about interpersonal demands. Maybe we do need to take a break. And you know, it just depends.
Exactly.
So
It depends. And also keep in mind that the communication loop, so sometimes when we ask for clarification, we feel like the world is on our shoulders. But keep in
mhm,
mind, this is a triadic communication and everyone is involved in the feedback loop. So if you are going, hey, I need to clarify this, and the other person is seeing the confusion, they're probably going to
mhm,
contribute to that feedback loop and ensure that they work at it until communication happens. In some cases, other factors are prioritized, and that's also part of
yes,
communication. So it depends.
yes. Lorena, thank you so much for coming. I know you need to go, and you were so gracious to give us a few more minutes of your time. I have personally learned so much. I walk away with so many insights that I didn't consider before, a new perspective. And as a trainer, I have benefited a lot from this session. So thank you so much, Lorena.
Thank you for the invitation.
Everybody say goodbye
Bye,
to Lorena.
everybody. Have a
Have
good
a
one.
have a wonderful rest of your day, Lorena.
You too. Bye bye.
Thank you.